Welcome to the Fully Mindful, where we explore what it means to live with intention, creativity, authenticity, and connection. I'm your host, Melissa Chareau, mindfulness and breathwork facilitator, neurodivergent lawyer and coach, and fellow human navigating this wild and beautiful ride we call life. On this podcast, we dive deep with interviews featuring inspiring guests, share solo mini episodes packed with guided mindfulness practices to help you center and thrive, and mix things up with tangents and sidebars, where my friend and fellow podcaster Debbie Harrell from the New World Normal joins me for some real, random, and meaningful conversations. So if you're ready to pause, reflect, and expand, you're in the right place. Let's get fully mindful.
What I was really doing was avoiding doing the inner work because I was a coward. I was too scared. It was too overwhelming and I was afraid. Yeah. And so I was distracting myself with all of this external stuff, all this big stuff, so that I didn't have to ever be real with myself. And there, you can't avoid it. It doesn't go away. I mean, it's always there. It's like you can't escape yourself. And the only way out is through.
Hey everyone, this is Melissa, host of The Fully Mindful, where we explore how people have found their purpose and meaning in life and career, and where I lead guided mindfulness practices and discussions about what mindfulness, compassion, and integration means for busy people. And today, a riveting episode. Settle in for this one, a little bit longer than usual, but you're going to want to hear all of this compelling interview with one of the most compelling people I've met. This interview has it all: alcohol, law, power, defeat, redemption, hope. Can you imagine having just been appointed to be the U.S. Attorney for the state of Oregon? Surely a powerful office. And you're in charge of keeping the entire District of Oregon safe from drug lords, sex traffickers, and fraudsters. Your whole adult life was leading to this point, and you have a family who loves you and friends who admire you. And on the inside, your entire world is falling apart. And to deal with it all, to escape it all, you're medicating yourself and hoping beyond all hope that the good you are doing in the world is washing away the despair that you are drowning in. In comes Amie Marshall to tell you how a smart woman ended up in the worst neighborhood there is, the neighborhood in between her own ears, and how she came out of it and to the other side. We talk about what it was like, what happened, and what it's like now. How years of sobriety, self-care, mindfulness, yoga, and hard work have supported her, and how she is a fully integrated human, restored to some sort of sanity that we could all hope for, and definitely to a life worth living. Welcome to this episode of The Fully Mindful. Hey everybody, this is Melissa with The Fully Mindful, and I am so excited to be here with Amie Marshall. I also know her as Amie because we grew up together. She's a lawyer, a mom, a woman extraordinaire. She's also a yogi. She meditates, and she's just an all-around amazing person. So welcome, Amie, Amanda.
Thank you, Melissa. It's so good to see you and talk to you.
Why don't you tell a little bit about how we know each other?
Oh, I'd love to. So I met Melissa in Mill Valley, California, when I was attending Tamalpais High School. And I believe it was my sophomore year and her junior year, but I think it might have been my junior year, her sophomore year was when we really got to know each other. And the way that we really got to know each other was that her boyfriend was one of my best friends for life. And he came to my house one day and sat at the table with my mom and I and said, my girlfriend Melissa's mother is moving to LA and I don't want her to go. So can she just live with you guys? And without getting, you may hear later in this podcast about my upbringing generally, but it was fairly loosey-goosey. And so we were the people that would say, oh yeah, sure, move in. So So Melissa moved in with me. You moved in with me and we shared a room and we're like sisters during that school year. And that is how we got to know each other.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. And for folks who don't know, Mill Valley, California is kind of a unique little place. And I had moved there clear across the country only a few years before. So I too was just getting to know this funny little place that is full of amazing artists, musicians, creatives, and movers and shakers. And definitely Mill Valley during the 80s was a time, was it not?
It was a crazy time. And I, like you, what's interesting with us, Melissa, is even now, after all these years, the more I get to know you, listening to your podcast and spending time with you, I learn that we have more and more in common. And one of the things is that I too moved to Mill Valley from someplace else. And I moved to Mill Valley in the middle of seventh grade
Mm.
and from Tucson, Arizona. And there had been nothing in my background that had prepared me for sort of the culture shock of Marin County in the 80s as a 12-year-old. It
Yeah,
was
so
really different than anything else I had ever experienced.
tell us a little bit about that. What was so different about
Well,
Marin
it
County?
was so, my family, I'd always felt like, interestingly, I'd always felt like my family was really different where every place else that we'd lived. And we moved pretty regularly when I was growing up. Every couple years we would move. So I lived in Puerto Rico, New Hampshire, Washington, D.C., Maryland, and then Tucson, and then Marin. And so we were sort of like free spirit, kind of hippie, sort of, my mom was always, it appeared to me that my mother was always kind of chasing the next thing.
Mm.
And my sister and I were kind of along for the ride in her own, journey of self-discovery, let's say. And so whether that was, a new boyfriend or a new guru or a new job or a new state, that was sort of what was going on. And my younger sister and I were kind of riding on her coattails through this adventure, the adventures that she was having. And everywhere else that we lived, I always thought that our family was weird. We weren't normal. We didn't have a nuclear family. We didn't, my mom had a boyfriend that was much younger and they smoked weed and did other drugs and they partied and they, sometimes stole things from stores. And I just wanted this normal, what I thought would be a normal, life, this kind of Brady Bunch existence, meat and potatoes and dinner together at the table and, some semblance of stability. And when we moved to Marin, it was almost like we moved where everybody else lived like us, you
Right.
know. It was like I wasn't so weird anymore in a way, although I was weird in other ways, which is that we were not rich. We did not have money.
That's
We
where you and
moved there.
I think, have a lot in common too,
Right.
because I think when I met you, I think I was living somewhere else, but I mean, my first landing was in Tam Valley in a small little first level apartment with my mother and her boyfriend, which that just wasn't done. I mean, Mill Valley people had some pretty serious money, which was, yeah.
I
And,
mean, they had money like people don't even understand. I mean,
yeah.
that's the thing. It's like I think a lot of people grow up and they see people with, and they say, "Oh, they have money." But I mean, I remember just, jaw drop, with the amount of money that people in Marin had. And some of the kids that you and I hung out with just had no inkling really of, I think, the privilege that they had.
100%. I mean,
But I
yeah.
did, right? And you did. So it was like this weird, you want to connect with people and you want to be friends with people, but I was always very conscious of the fact that I wasn't like those people, that I didn't have the things that they had. And that's not to say that my friends that they didn't love me or that they weren't incredibly generous, but there's a way in which that generosity can make me as a kid feel super uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Like people are always giving me things and their parents are taking me on vacation with them. And, I'm I mean, luckily I had friends to give me hand-me-downs because I never could have afforded the clothes that everybody else wore at middle school if I wasn't raiding the closets of my girlfriends. That said, in my friend group, I definitely had other peers that were in a really similar socioeconomic position as me, the other girls in Tam Valley,
Right.
where you and I lived, which was kind of the low rent district.
Right.
And then in the house that I lived in, which was sort of, as you know, where you lived with me up on the hill in Tam Valley, that was kind of the nice part of Tam Valley. But the only way we could ever afford that house was that my mother always had to rent her room out. So I grew up with roommates all the time because we couldn't have afforded the rent on that house without double bunking. My sister shared a room with my mother. And then I, at times, had my own room, shared a room with you,
Right.
shared a room with my sister at some times. But so, yeah, so that we could rent out a room. And I always shared a bathroom with whoever the tenants were that my mom rented to. And it was very important to my mom that we create this image of wealth that was a lie.
Hmm.
So, we needed to live in the house up on the hill. And, I needed to wear the right clothes. And the way that she did that was with credit cards, and which eventually led her to bankruptcy and losing the house my junior year in high school.
Yeah, because I always, when I lived with you, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I was young and sort of out of it and, self-centered and all that stuff. And I just thought, oh, these people had tons of money and they were well off, just like virtually everybody else I knew, except for the kids in Marin City, right?
Mhm.
And everyone had so much money that I just assumed that everybody but me and a couple of kids from Marin City, had a ton of money. And yet, so I mean, your mother did an outstanding job, right?
Yeah, until she lost the house and declared
Right.
bankruptcy and then moved into a place in Muir Beach that was so small and so remote that my sister and I really couldn't live there and make it to school. So we, I guess, the summer before my senior year, my sister, I believe, may have gone and lived with my dad, and I moved it, found my own place, started paying rent and supporting myself
Right. In your senior year in high school.
the summer before my
The
senior
summer
year.
before.
Yeah.
So you're what, 16,
17.
17 by that
Hmm.
point? Wow. I mean, did did it occur to you at that time that that was quite a heavy load to bear?
No, because I had developed coping mechanism, and I am not even conscious of when it happened because I think it was so early in my childhood. I I was the person that took care of everything. I
Mm,
was the adult in the house. I took care of my sister and my mother. I cooked dinner. I mean, today I know there's two words for it. One is I was a parentified child, and the other is I was a codependent. I was trained at a very young age to serve other people.
mhm.
And so I got a lot of, and it was rewarding to me. I got a huge sense of satisfaction from the fact that I could take care of myself and I
Uh-huh.
didn't need anybody else. And I didn't, I had learned not to rely on my parents. And so in some ways, I moved into my best friend Teal's house and rented a room from her mom. And so it wasn't like I was out on my own living in some apartment. I mean, I was still living with the mom, and Teal's mom was very much like a mom to me. And so it was, in some ways, it was like a relief because I didn't have to take care of anybody except myself
Mm,
in that house.
mhm.
I just had, yeah, I had to work and pay rent. I had to go to school, but I just only was taking care of me. I was no longer responsible for my mom or my sister or other, you know, or having kind of drama and instability and people coming in and out. It was just, kind of go to work and pay my bills and go to school and go home and eat dinner and go to sleep.
Right. It wasn't so much of what you had dreamed of maybe in the seventh grade or earlier as
Mm-mm.
your sort of like meat and potato dinner family, but in a way, it was. I mean, you created this
Yeah, I mean,
structure.
I was really good from a pretty young age at finding grown-ups to, that could be trusted. And so usually I loved school, and I was blessed to have attended many very quality schools. I mean, I'll give my mom that. She was really good at making sure that and she had gone to college and been a teacher. That was her initial career when I was born. And so that was something that was important to both of my parents. And so going to quality schools with good teachers, and I would always sort of glom on to, a teacher and, be kind of the teacher's pet. And I found refuge in school because it was orderly
Yeah.
and I knew what to expect. And there were rules and there was structure. And those are things that I really thrived on, which is, I think, partly what brought me to the practice of law.
Yes, no, 100%. And that's where you and I also have a lot in common, both lawyers. But one of the things that attracted me, and I don't think I could have consciously have said this, so I'm wondering if it was a conscious choice for you. But for me, I call it, I sort of accidental lawyering because I I had always been a creative. I thought I was going to be a poet, except you couldn't make any money that way, so that was a no-go. But I was attracted to law because of the structure and the rules and the predictability that I
Mm.
thought it would give me.
Let's take a quick break.
Hey, everybody, this is Melissa with the Fully Mindful. It's the new year, and I bet you're feeling the need to unlock your full potential and embrace empowerment, or maybe something completely different. Well, I'm excited to offer a new program with one-on-one breathwork and coaching sessions. We'll embark on a truly transformative journey of self-discovery, combining conscious, connected breathwork and embodiment coaching, and more. So contact me, Melissa, at the Fully Mindful, for your transformative session today.
Absolutely. I mean, I will say there's one thing we differ from because I never considered myself a creative. I always really envied, and I'm very drawn to people that are creatives. Many of the people that I'm closest to are incredibly talented artists. So I admire that and I'm drawn to that, but it's not something I see in myself. Although I guess the exception to that is theater, which I was involved in as a kid and in high school. And I I used to think that that's what I wanted to do, that I wanted to be an actress. And actually I feel like I'm a litigator, so I ended up being an actress.
Well, I was gonna say, I've often said that I'm no longer a creative, that that law school beat that out of me. And in some ways, I suppose that's true. But in other ways, no, because that's exactly what litigators do, right? We put on a performance, we tell a story, we have to create a narrative. Granted, they're out of the facts that are provided, but nobody provides the storyline. You create it.
Right. And that's something, I mean, that's interesting because I guess I have this reactivity. I think what you're saying is absolutely true. And I also have a response to it internally, which makes me uncomfortable because, I mean, that's certainly, if you go to a training for trial practice, that's exactly what you're going to be taught is how to create a narrative. And that that's how you persuade jurors because they are going to be persuaded by a compelling narrative, not by the actual evidence. And so, if you end up just talking about the evidence and being very dry and clinical, that they lose it. They don't have an attention to it. And but if you weave some story that's very compelling and emotional and has an arc to it, whether or not it even is the truth is irrelevant.
Mm.
because the facts are the facts and nobody knows the story. So you really have this sort of poetic license to come up as the lawyer, because you're not under oath and you're not testifying. So you can take the evidence that's been offered at trial, and then you can create whatever narrative you want in order to persuade the jury, and or create reasonable doubt or create a lack of reasonable doubt, either way, if we're talking about a criminal case. And that contrasts that to what an actor actually does, right? Because if you go see a play or if you go see a movie, you know that you're watching fiction. You don't have any expectation that there's not an ethical issue. And when I say ethical, I don't mean legal ethics, because as you know, legal ethics are completely different than like human ethics,
Right.
because it's completely ethical for a lawyer to stand up in front of a jury and create a narrative that they don't believe is true, as long as it is in line with the facts of the evidence that's been introduced at trial. It can all be hypothetical, and that's fine. But the jury doesn't necessarily understand that, even though there's a jury instruction that says, the statements of the lawyer are not evidence. I don't think they really they're being moved by what you're saying, and you're persuading them in that way. And so, yeah, to me, it's very sad that the law, in fact, is more of a theatrical performance, and often more of a contest between who's more appealing and compelling than how the facts and the law actually fit together.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely agree with that. And I guess, I mean, you and I are probably, I'm guessing, more similar than not when we go to trial, which is that we we tell compelling stories, but they are 100% within the evidence. And
Within the evidence, but I would say also, Melissa, I mean, I don't, so one of the big differences is I practice criminal defense now.
yeah, it's a little
So
bit different, right?
if I can, I mean, my job is to be a zealous advocate for my client, and that is not your job when you represent the state. When you represent the state, your job is to do justice.
Right.
And although I think many people that represent the state are not aligned with that anymore,
Probably true.
but as a criminal defense attorney, if my client doesn't testify and the state stands up and introduces all kinds of, circumstantial evidence designed to convict my client, and if my client has not testified, I can stand up and I can spin any narrative I want about a bushy-haired stranger, or the state didn't, to create reasonable doubt. And that's absolutely my duty. That's my ethical duty. I would be remiss, I would be not constitutionally sufficient if I thought I shouldn't point out all the other things that may have happened besides my client, committing a crime. Because that's literally my job, is to test the proof of the state and create reasonable doubt,
I guess what
whether
I'm
or
saying,
not I think that's what happened.
100%. That is
Yeah.
100% a criminal defense attorney's job. I guess the distinction I'm making is that I don't know that you're doing so within the bounds of your ethical duties to
As a lawyer,
as a lawyer.
right, but not
And yeah.
necessarily as a yogi.
Yeah. Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about that. We kind of got off on this tangent, and that's my
Mhm.
fault. We were in high school for a moment and then we ended up in the law. But I don't know, and I don't know if this is something that, obviously you loved acting, and I think you and I both ended up, we don't need to name names, but we were in acting classes with like people who, actually became working actors. And,
Mhm.
but neither of us did. I want to point that neither of us were successful at that. I don't know that you tried. I certainly didn't either, but
I did community theater for a while just for fun,
yeah,
and it's really a good outlet.
it's really fun. And I loved theater. It was my favorite class. It was the only thing that I think between that and maybe English class that made me feel sort of half human in high school at Tam High. So I totally appreciate that. I don't know, what was your favorite class in high school?
I loved English also.
Mhm.
I would say drama and English, but drama was really dramatic. And
Yeah.
maybe it's just because of like the boyfriends that I had in the club. At some point you need to like move to another pond. But I didn't have the affinity. I wasn't one of Dan Caldwell's, and that was the teacher. I
Yeah.
wasn't one of his favorites. And so I think English, Mr. Gaynor's class.
Mr. Gaynor was
Yeah,
like my favorite teacher of all time, and I actually ended up working for him after high school.
I loved him, and I loved Mrs. Johnson,
Hmm.
who was very different than Mr. Gaynor,
Yeah.
but I adored her. And I also loved social studies. Mr. Gosh, I want to say it's not Grant. He passed away maybe 10 years ago from HIV. He was one of I think when we were in high school, the only kind of outwardly gay teacher in
I
the
can't remember
school.
his name, but I know exactly who you're talking about.
And he taught US government, I think I
Hmm.
took from him. And so really lively kind of debate, kind of
Yes.
sort of class.
Which is maybe why you ended up being what I'm going to call a debate nerd later on in life. I mean, everyone I've ever talked to who did debate is like in love with debate. And
Yeah,
they
it's
have,
like Dungeons and Dragons. It's
yes.
definitely on like the nerd scale. And like when you are in it, it's very insular, and you
Hmm.
sort of have your own language, and it is just super, super nerdy, super intellectual. It's like for people that love to spend time. I mean, back in the day, it was in the library, with in the parts of the library where other people don't go, being one with the Dewey Decimal System and in the periodicals, and arguing over the validity of different peer-reviewed research. And in fact, I was my first foray into the law library was we had a Supreme Court topic when I was in college on the debate team. And I spent the whole year in the law library researching Indian law and decided I wanted to go to law school. So I think that I was a debater and a lawyer, and I didn't know it, you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
and it was a process of discovery, because I know that when I was younger, I really hadn't, it took me a long time to find my voice. I Because I was always the new kid, and I always felt weird, and I always wanted to be popular, and I wanted people to like me.
Hmm.
And so I was always trying so hard to be whatever everybody else wanted me to be and to fit in. And if that meant, dressing a certain way, or listening to certain music, or doing certain drugs, or smoking cigarettes, or, whatever it took, I was going to do it. And it wasn't until college, after, by the way, so this is another part of our story in common, but I had gotten, I had been a drug addict as a kid, and had ended up, dropping out of school, dealing drugs on the street, by the time I was 14. And I got clean when I was 16. And from 16 to 19, my trajectory was just straight up. Once I got clean and I got back into school, and I started volunteering, and I started the first peer support program for teens in Marin County at Tam High with your old boyfriend, our common friend, Robert.
He's
And
more
Robert and I
common
started.
for the listeners. We actually, not at the same time, but we actually dated the same boy, but just
More
at a
than one
different
of the
time.
same boys,
More
just if
than
we're
one.
being honest.
Just if we're being 100% honest, but not at
And
the
you
same
just kind
time.
of share, yeah,
Never
kind of
at the
share the
same
boys,
time.
yeah, with your friends. That's how good of friends we are. And so Robert and I were both, he actually took me to my very first Narcotics Anonymous meeting, and that's how I ended up getting clean. And then he and I and our other friend Kara started a peer counseling program for kids at Tam High. And so and I worked hard. I was was supporting myself. I always had a job, paid for my own car, my own insurance, my own maintenance, my own clothes. And by the time when I was 18 and I graduated, I went to community college at College of Marin, and something else you and I have in common. And I thought I was going to go to Berkeley, which is what you did and what my friend Susie did. And College of Marin was sort of a feeder school for the Cal system. But I was impatient. I'm still impatient. I blame it on my ADD, or maybe it's because I'm an Aries, probably a combination of both. But I really hated going to College of Marin. I was very uncomfortable and depressed that year. I was working 2 jobs. I was a live-in nanny and I was a waitress at the Good Earth restaurant in Kentfield. And I was going full-time to College of Marin. So I was just always working or in school. And my mom and my sister had both left the country. They were living in New Zealand. So I didn't have any family. And I just was like, I can't do this for another year. And in the meantime, one of my best friends was going to University of Oregon, invited me up. I came up during the summer to see the Grateful Dead. And she said, why don't you just apply to U of O? Or you could just go to community college up here in Eugene until they let you in. And I said, okay. And I packed up my bags and I moved to Eugene and I applied and got in and started going to University of Oregon. And that's where I found the debate team. But the other thing that happened was when I moved to Eugene, I left my community. I think I had taken for granted, recently, Melissa, one of our classmates died as a result of the disease of addiction. And there was a big memorial for him about a week ago in Cronkite Beach and in the Bay Area. And my sister spoke at that event. And one of the things that she said was that, and I should mention, my sister's also in long-term recovery from addiction. And one of the things that she said was that, it was so strange growing up in Marin for many reasons. And you hear a lot of negative things about it. Like we had a free, we were all kind of feral children with free access to drugs and alcohol and very little supervision. It was just all sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And not everybody survived it. And nobody survived it unscarred. But on the other hand, there was a magic. And there was this magic of place and time and people that connected us all in such a beautiful way. And there's so much love now between these, 50-something-year-old Marin kids, the ones that have made it through, because the only way out is through. You got to walk through the stuff to get to the other side. There's such a love there that we have the ability to drop into, and it can empower us. And when I left that community, which I think at that time I really didn't appreciate because I was just sick of it and I wanted out and I, was wanting something different. I moved to a place where nobody knew me. I mean, there were a couple of people I went to school with that were from Mill Valley, but I was meeting all these new people. And when I would talk to people about my childhood or about my history with drugs and alcohol, their jaws would drop. I mean, they just didn't really, like I was a weirdo again. I was there was this distance. And so I just decided to stop telling people about it. And I just, without realizing it, I really recreated myself into this, Little Miss Perfect, into this just really bright, really successful overachiever girl that, could take care of everything and everyone. And I lived that role for the next 25 years until the wheels came off.
And that's an incredible amount of pressure, right? To live in this way that is not, I mean, it is 100% you, but it's also not 100% you, right? It's, yes, you are the successful, outgoing, driven, smart, capable, competent person. and also, and also, right?
Yeah, and we
And
all have a shadow, and I think it's there's something in our culture that is so destructive, which is this, addiction that we have for talking about other people's failures and exploiting other people's pain.
it's like a sport.
Um,
It's like a sport,
right.
really.
So, and somehow there's this seems to be this unspoken understanding that especially if somebody is, quote unquote famous, if they're a public person that gets a benefit from being in the public eye,
Mhm.
that they've waived any right to be treated with compassion.
Yeah.
And maybe they have, like, I don't really necessarily have an opinion on that one way or another, other than to say, regardless of that, it's bad for us. It's bad for our children. It's bad for everybody to make a sport out of shaming and degrading other human beings, as opposed to demonstrating how we have compassion and
Right.
how we take care of people that are suffering, not, throw another rock at their head.
It doesn't mean that, say somebody does something they shouldn't do, arguably, right? And they're in, and we'll get into your specific details. And I'm not saying you should or shouldn't have done things, but let's just say somebody does something that we don't
Oh,
agree.
I shouldn't have done things.
So we'll get to that in a moment. But like, if somebody's out there acting out in a way that is not okay, it doesn't mean that they're not held responsible. You can still have compassion for somebody
That's
and
right.
hold them responsible. In fact, maybe the most compassionate thing to do is to hold somebody responsible, but not with shame,
Mhm.
not with ridicule.
But still treating people with dignity and respect,
Right.
because that's what I always say is, we don't want to become the people that we're condemning.
Right.
We don't want to become everything that we despise. I mean, that's what I always think about politics. It's like, I frankly don't like either of the two major parties, because I think that they both kind of succumb to this gladiator style mentality of, the important thing is just to win, or the important thing is just to, like, the ends justify the means.
Right.
And we will revert to the lowest common denominator of interacting, in order to, we'll use shame, we'll use dishonesty and manipulation and fear mongering, and for me, I guess, again, as a yogi, it's all about the practice, not the outcome. So
Mm.
it's about right now, in every moment, living my life with integrity, being the yogi in the room, remembering that as much as I can in all of my interactions, or like they say in the recovery community, following these principles in all of our affairs. It's not just when I'm sitting in the chair in a meeting. Uh,
Right.
it's 24/7. And that's the way that I have found peace is, and the area that I continue to struggle with is the law,
Mhm.
because in order to serve my clients, I resort to ways of being with people and ways of communicating, which in my practice would, I guess the kindest way to put it would be, it's not wise speech.
Right.
It's not wise livelihood.
Mhm.
It's not congruent with in yoga with the yamas and the niyamas, or in Buddhism with the precepts or the Eightfold Path.
Yeah.
And, but, and sometimes I go to a deposition and it's all about, you know, posturing and gamesmanship and manipulation, and yeah, really gamesmanship and manipulation and posturing, I guess, are the things. And it's very toxically masculine. And I don't mean that to say that the men in the deposition are oppressing the women because I do it. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I'm good at it, right? Like I can whip mine out and it's bigger than anyone's in the room.
Right.
I can play that game and I have those skills. And so it's oppressive, it's controlling, it's all of these things. And I can do well with it and I can get a good result for my client and I can walk out feeling like we made progress in the case in a way that's going to benefit my client. And then I will go home and cry and take a shower and, meditate and do yoga for 3 hours, just trying to get back to some sense of equanimity.
Yeah, I had the same issue when I was a prosecutor. So, and I don't know if you did too, and we'll get
I
into this
don't
in a moment, but
know, but I do now.
yeah,
When I
so
look back at it, I wish I
like
did.
I was, well, I was a sober member in a recovery community,
Mm, right.
and I have been for a very long time, and and always was as a prosecutor. And so I had a lot of difficulty because, of course, most of the people I was prosecuting were people who needed recovery, whose main affliction was their drug and alcohol abuse, which made them do what they did. And not all. And I certainly was 100% righteous for the people who were not. And they were just straight up criminals. I have no other way to put it. But I had a lot of difficulty and had to find ways to square my practice with my practice.
Mhm.
And a lot of it was, we learn in the recovery community, the results are not up to me. I show up, I do my job, and the result is not up to me. And what a relief that is. It really is. It's not up to me. I do what I can, I do my job, and I do it well, and the result is not up to me. And that was helpful, but it was still very difficult sometimes to, and get creative and also go home and cry and meditate
Yeah.
and do all the things. And that is a really challenging part of being a lawyer and also a yogi or a meditator or somehow
Mhm.
on this path
Mhm.
is how can we act always with that kind of integrity and
Well, and
also do the
I
job.
think what when I was a government lawyer, when I was a prosecutor and a lawyer representing DHS child welfare, I I up until I was US attorney, one of the things that I took for granted and now really appreciate is the autonomy that I had to make decisions in my individual cases. So when I
Mhm.
was a deputy DA in Coos County, I never once I never once took a case that I hadn't made all the decisions on. I started and oversaw the domestic violence prosecution unit. We did vertical prosecution. I had the cases from intake all the way through, and I made every decision, and I didn't have to get clearance from anybody. I
Right.
think the only thing that I needed approval for was like right when Measure 11 passed, I think we had to get a sign off to charge somebody with the Measure 11.
Mhm.
But again, it wasn't a situation where somebody would be telling me, you have to prosecute this Measure 11. It would be a situation where I would be going to the chief deputy saying, I think this is appropriate for Measure 11 and getting sign off. So I was never in a situation where I thought that where I had concerns about sort of whether or not a charge or an outcome or a sentence was the
Mhm.
right thing. Now that said, I was completely, if when I look back to that woman, that 26, 27-year-old prosecutor, I'm not proud.
Mhm.
I was overzealous. I was judgmental. I was sanctimonious. I was a hard ass. I never saw a domestic violence case that wasn't an assault to or a kidnapping.
And for
I
those who don't know, Measure 11 in Oregon is
think
the mandatory sentencing. It's for serious crimes, but it's mandatory sentencing. So the judge has no discretion. In other words, if you prosecute a Measure 11 crime, there is a specific sentence that the judge must impose if the person's convicted. And they're
And
quite
the
clear.
sentences are long,
Mhm.
and they don't include any good time programming or early release. And so typically people are sent to the most maximum security prison in Oregon, which happens to be in Eastern Oregon, 8 hours away from the metro area. So it's difficult for people to visit. I mean, I have clients now that have been in this situation, and I
Yeah.
really, so now as a defense attorney, I see the destruction of lives and family
Mhm.
that I caused those 5 years when I was state prosecutor. And so so it's just different than what you described, because I wasn't clean and sober. But at the time that I was a prosecutor doing criminal cases in state court, I felt very righteous.
Mhm.
But I also was never in the situation where I had to do something that I didn't want to do. When I was a lawyer and assistant attorney general at Oregon Department of Justice representing DHS, that was a little bit different because I was representing a client agency. So I wasn't just representing, the abstract people of the state of Oregon, which is really like whatever I think it should be. So
Right. Which is
I
what was
was
great about being a prosecutor, right? Is that
right. I was representing DHS Child Welfare. They were the client agency. And so they were making decisions based on their policy in cases where children were neglected and abused and in foster care and potentially moving towards some permanent plan other than return to parent. And so sometimes I wouldn't, so like you, I would see parents that where if it wasn't for their addiction, there would be no barrier to their parenting.
right?
And I would see, because we were statewide, I would see that, say, in Klamath County, a mom in the same situation as a mom in Portland would end up with her rights terminated and her children being adopted out because there were no services.
Hmm.
Not because she was not trying, or not because she didn't have what it took to parent, but because in Klamath County, they don't have, the services that she would
Mhm.
need, or there's not a bed available. Or in order to get into the program, you first have to fail at outpatient treatment. That's a criteria to get into inpatient
Mhm.
treatment, which isn't evidence-based. It's an economic issue
Right.
because they don't have enough beds. And so by the time you go through and fail at outpatient, now that what we call the ASPA timelines, the time that kids can sit in foster care before having a permanent plan, you've run out of time right at
Right.
the point where you're finally getting a bed in inpatient. But in Portland, there's services. So a parent in the same situation, you end up with reunification because they're able to get into an evidence-based treatment program and peer support and mentors and all the things. And so the children are returned, which is always the best thing for both, not the parents, but for the children.
Right.
We know the outcomes of long-term foster care and even adoption are not great in the child welfare system, especially compared to kids that end up being returned to a parent. So that was my first foray into, I sometimes have to argue things and represent positions in court that I don't agree with, and go
Mhm.
home and cry in the shower and do all those things. And at that time it was also drink
Right.
copious amounts of alcohol, and that always helped.
That was your solution at the time. Yeah.
Yeah, it worked while it worked. I always say I didn't have a drinking problem. I had a living problem and a drinking solution.
Yeah, 100%. And, so I mean, you did that for quite some time, and then you had this incredible opportunity. And I actually remember talking with you, walking through the Oregon Zoo. I don't know if you remember this. And you said, what if I were to be the US attorney for
I don't remember. I kind of remember the zoo, but I don't remember the conversation.
and I was like, wow, I mean, I impressed, but also it was a weird thing because we had sort of reunited, in Oregon after I had gone to law school and become a lawyer, and you'd been a lawyer for longer than me. And your career was definitely had taken off and was doing so great. But I remember having this conversation with you because I was sober and you were not. And but I had no judgment about that. I just was like, oh, wow, we could have this thing in common for some time and then we don't. And I just remember kind of marveling, like, wow, you hear all these stories about these people who have been in recovery and then they go
Right.
out and their life is burned to the ground and it's awful and it's chaos and they either die or they go to treatment or they go to jail or they come back. And I remember walking through the zoo and I was with you and having this conversation and I was like, wow, I guess that's all wrong.
Hey, everybody, if you like this conversation, make sure to rate the show in Apple or Spotify or wherever you are listening so that others can find it and enjoy it too. And if you like the show and want to keep hearing great conversations with really interesting people about how they found their purpose, please donate to the show. Go to thefullymindful.com to donate today.
Oh God, I'm so glad you brought that up. That's such a poignant thing that you're saying that I think is so important for other people that are struggling either with addiction or struggling in recovery, because there's this narrative in some recovery circles, because there are many paths to recovery, but there's literally saying that if you pick up a drink or a drug, the only outcomes are jails, institutions, and death.
Mhm.
And I know that for me, that was really powerful, keeping me, that was a powerful fear motivator to
Right.
not drink and use drugs. And what I have found now, where I'm at today, is that when I am motivated by fear, it's not sustainable
Mhm.
in a way that serves me.
Mhm.
When I'm making choices today, I pretty much find that I am generally motivated by one of two drives, and one is fear and the other is love.
Yeah.
And so when I'm working with women in recovery in my practice now, I really make an effort not to go with fear as a motivator, and not to say things like, what's out there, if but to say, to focus on the love, like how would drinking serve your relationship with your children? How would it, like, what would it do to help you connect with yourself? Like, how would it, right? So it's more like leaning into the love instead of, away from the fear. And I think that the other thing I know about myself is that, so before in recovery, we call it a relapse. And if you're in a program that considers, abstinence as the standard, then if you drink or use, that's a relapse. A year before I had my first drink or drug, I was continually abstinent from all drugs and alcohol for 6 years. And a year before I started drinking and using again, I made a decision to drink and use again.
Mhm.
And I
This is another
started,
place you and I have in common because I have, I guess, I have no judgment about people who use the word relapse, but that's not my experience. My
right,
experience was a decision.
right. Absolutely. It was, and in fact, I was in my parlance and in my mind at that time, I didn't relapse because I was not an alcoholic.
Exactly.
I just convinced myself and the people that I thought were important to convince
Hmm.
that I was not an alcoholic. And I spent a year basically kind of priming everybody for this idea while I was still not drinking and using, but also not working a program and not, doing anything to feed my recovery. I even flew to Illinois and spent time with my AA sponsor to like explain this to her. It's so anyone that knows me
It's kind of
knows that
comical.
I'm the master explainer, right? Which is
Right.
really a manipulation. It's really like, I want you to see me the way that I want you to see me, and I want to control the way that you see me. So both my sister and I have this horrible habit of just over explaining everything until, literally my boyfriend fell asleep on the phone last night. And then he pretended that he didn't. And then this morning he's like, I was asleep. I'm like, yeah, I know.
But you still kept explaining, even though you knew he was asleep, didn't you?
Yeah. No, I just knew he was quiet. And then I was like, are you there? And there was quiet. I was like, John. And then he said, oh, yeah. I just dropped the phone. Sure. That's what happens when you fall asleep. You drop the phone. So anyway, I had to explain to my sponsor that I wasn't an alcoholic. I just was a kid with all this trauma who ended up using cocaine, and cocaine is really bad and it's really addictive. And if you use cocaine all the time when you're 13, of course, it's going to impact your brain, and then all these bad things will happen. But, the truth is I never really drank much. Drugs were more accessible to me than alcohol most of the time. And so I figured, like, now I'm 21. I was 22 when I started drinking and using again. So I was like, now I'm 22 and I can just drink like an adult, and I will never do, as long as I didn't do cocaine or any other white drugs, I would be fine, right? I wouldn't do meth or Molly or, anything that was sort of stimulating, and I'd be fine with alcohol, weed, LSD, mushrooms, anything else I wanted to do. And I remember my sponsor saying, well, gosh, Amie, I don't know what you want from me. Like, if you want me to say you're not an alcoholic, like, I can't do that. I love you and I'm here for you, but whether or not you're an alcoholic is really something between you and your higher power. And I can't tell you, I can't give you permission. I can't,
Right.
make this all okay.
It sounds like she was modeling the love that you're talking about.
Oh,
Right?
absolutely. And by the way, she's still there. Like, when I was in rehab 25 years later, she was still there for me.
Yeah.
And she was one of the first people I saw when I got out of rehab and went back to Marin County where we grew up. And it was like no time had passed. She was talking to me like I was still 16. Amie, do you think that's a good idea? And no, I guess not. But so then when I relapsed for 25 years, but I want to say something about back to the point you had made is I worked so hard to compensate for the fact that I had previously identified myself as an addict, to try to prove to everybody. So I think a lot of the overachievement and the running on the hamster wheel and the, being the perfect mom and the perfect wife and the perfect, lawyer and, and just all the, I did so much volunteer work. Like, I served on boards. I just didn't sleep. I didn't take care of myself. I didn't, ever ask myself what I needed. And nobody else did either, because I think I had made it really clear to everybody that I didn't need you to ask me what I needed. I didn't need anybody to worry about me because I was in control. And I think I was fed by that need to show everybody that I was not going to end up in jails, institutions, or death, that would mean that I'm not an addict. That's the lie part right there.
Right.
The lie is that if you're an addict, you're going to end up in jails, institutions, and death. And what I'm here to tell you is that I know so many lawyers that are addicts. I know so many cops that are addicts. I know so many doctors, which are a lot of my clients, who are addicts. And they do not end up in jails, institutions, and death. The people that end up in jails, institutions, and death are poor people and people of color. And that's why we needed to pass ballot measure 110 in Oregon, which I'll just soapbox on, is because arresting people for drugs, for crimes that are related to drugs and alcohol is something that we do when it's inconvenient for white people to have people who are on drugs and alcohol. Because there's plenty of people that are using drugs and alcohol every day in ways that are very destructive, but they're doing it in their home, and they have a driver, or they have money to take an Uber, or they have great lawyers that make it all go away.
Right.
And they aren't held accountable. And even when they are, they don't get the same sentences that people get who have public defenders. They do significantly less time, and they're able to buy their way out of a lot of the time spent incarcerated that poor people don't have the resources to buy their way out of. So I just want to say, like, when I'm in some communities now in recovery in those rooms, and I hear people say, the outcome is jails, institutions of death, I cringe a little bit, because I think you're setting up this lie that as long as I have a job, I'm not an addict. That as long as and that's what I told myself for 25 years. And in the meantime, I was on the inside completely destroyed. I mean,
And I
my
think
insides did not match my outsides.
100%. And I think this is such an important message right here that we talk about, because you can be dying inside. And in fact, you probably were.
I was,
And
yeah.
you had convinced yourself that because you were not in a jail, you were not institutionalized, and you were not dead, even if maybe at times, I don't know about, I can't speak for you, but some of us wished we were. And that it's 100% a lie. I don't,
I was
and
surrounded.
it's so dangerous. It's so
Yeah.
dangerous, because maybe eventually you will end up dead, right? It's just
I
you're going to
had a
have this
death wish.
agonizing
I
thing.
mean, yeah, I wished for death all the time. I fantasized about death. I had suicidal ideations. I luckily was in therapy. So
And
I
this
had
is
somebody.
meantime, for people who don't like have a full appreciation, because we haven't yet talked about it, although we've alluded to it. You were the U.S. attorney for the state of Oregon.
Right. Yeah, I was at the top of my game. I mean, in fact, when, after kind of my fall from grace, some of my friends and colleagues, and even people I didn't know, would opine about how I had it all, and it's sort of like, what was wrong with her? Like, she had everything and she just destroyed it. And they're not wrong. I mean, and what I found was, when I had everything I had ever wanted, the family, the husband, the kids, the house, the job, the notoriety, every day I was surrounded by people telling me I was amazing, how great I was. And every day it felt like the administration gave me more responsibility and more, recognition for the things that I was doing, and involved me at a higher level on more important issues. And they were things that I loved working on, Native American issues, child exploitation. I mean, so a lot of things that were near and dear to my heart. And I couldn't have ever seen as a child that, if anybody would have told me, I would have just laughed. But there were a couple things going on. One was this imposter syndrome, the idea that I didn't deserve any of it, that I was internally somehow, blackened and dirty and not worthy of any of the good things that were happening, and that at any moment it would all be taken away from me. And that if any of these people, especially that I worked with in the federal courthouse, federal judges, U.S. attorneys office staff, even the federal defenders and the other lawyers, that we worked with in federal court, that if that kind of demographic of people that loved me and that, told me how great I was, if they knew the truth about me, if they knew that I was this, drug-addled street kid out doing crimes, to get a fix, they would, I'd be kicked out of the club. Like the gig would be up. It would absolutely, and the people I was around, and I don't know if this was your experience. I hope it wasn't at the DA's office, but it was certainly my experience both in Coos County and at the federal courthouse that people used, derogatory language to describe kids like me. That, people who were drug addicts were referred to as junkies and tweakers and
Mhm.
perps and crack whores. And, I just thought, what if they knew I was those things?
Right. Well, it's much
Um,
easier to otherize people, so that you don't have to deal with the pain of being empathetic and having
because
compassion.
because empathy means that you see yourself in somebody
Mhm.
else. So it's the understanding that as human beings, we could all have all of the darkness and all of the light of any other human being at any
Yes.
time, given those circumstances. We're all capable of the most heinous crimes and the most amazing feats of love,
Mhm.
given the right circumstances. And but what happens in the criminal justice system, in my experience, and I know that I did this too, is that when I other people and I use derogatory language or I, say that's not me, I would never do that,
Mhm.
then I feel safer
Mhm.
because I have put that distance between me and them, as opposed to saying, but for the grace of God go I.
Right.
And again, like you said, it's not a matter of whether or not there should be consequences for actions or whether or not we need to protect vulnerable victims from, violence, but it's a question of how we do that. And whether it's informed by an understanding that we are all in this together and we're trying to find solutions that benefit everybody, which
Mhm.
means the offender as well as the victim, because if we're going to make our community safer, that means we have to restore the offender, not
Mhm.
just the victim. We have to create a human being that's going to come out better than they went in.
Yeah.
And so I was in that mode, that whole imposter syndrome when they find out thing. The other thing that happened is I always really did believe that if I worked so hard, I would somehow like clean the shadow self off. Like the grime would go away and I wouldn't feel like that anymore. That if I did everything right, if I was on the side of truth and justice and I helped victims and I volunteered and was on boards and was at the soccer game and made my kids organic food. And you know what I mean? Like if I
Yeah.
did all the right shit, I would be okay. I would finally stop being this anxious, parentified child on a hamster wheel trying to keep all the balls in the air so that everybody would be safe. And it didn't happen, and it actually got worse. And so I got to the point where really there was nothing, it was like there's nothing more I was getting. Like this is the best it's gonna get. And I feel the worst I've ever felt. I was like running 5 miles a day just with anxiety, and then going to this little market on the waterfront, buying a pack of cigarettes and smoking half of them and then throwing them away and running back. I was sleeping maybe 3 hours every 24 hours. And that was only at the behest of multiple Ambien and Klonopin and a couple bottles of wine. I mean, I was throwing up every day on the way to work. And and even though I was surrounded by people that loved me, I had never felt so alone in my entire life.
That's because they didn't really see the real you.
Yeah, because I didn't see me. No,
Yeah.
I mean, I was so disconnected from my body,
Mm.
my soul, like on every level. I don't think I remember the first time I cried was in a meeting that they took us to when I'd been in rehab about 10 days. And I don't think I had cried for 7 years.
Mhm.
I just didn't let myself experience emotions like that. Vulnerability, I should say, not emotions, because I certainly had anger and, I had emotions, but I didn't have vulnerability. And at the end, I did. At the end, I was sort of falling apart and I was asking for help and I was desperately wanting, my husband, other people. I wanted somebody to take care of me, but it was really too late. And I really hadn't ever cultivated those types of relationships with anybody because I'd never let myself be vulnerable with anybody. So I didn't have the kind of friends or the kind of marriage where somebody would be comfortable in a caregiving role with me.
Right. Well, you had always taken care of business, right? You were always in control. And, and I so 100% relate with that. I feel like I'm saying 100% a lot because I relate so much with you and your story and that sort of walling off parts of ourselves in an effort to try to be this other person that we think is somehow better, right? And not integrating our full selves with every part of ourselves and to be vulnerable with others, to let other people in such that we could ask for help, right? So it's kind of this perfect irony, right? I mean, and I guess I want to say that too. You talked about, what kind of walling yourself off or, thought you could clean off this part of yourself. And I guess the irony is, at least in recovery, in certain recovery circles, we learn that it's our experience, our full experience, that actually benefits other people. So who we are, blemishes and shadows and all of it, is actually what is helpful to other people. It's the
And the
vulnerability that
only way,
helps.
it's the only way that we learn, my experience, it's the only way that we learn anything is through failure and pain and mistakes, right? It's somehow our culture doesn't celebrate that. We celebrate the champion and the winner. And, but the truth is, like, I don't know anybody that's worth knowing that doesn't have some kind of story to tell of great pain and great loss and horrible missteps. That's the way that character happens. That's the way that we learn things. That's the way that we have compassion and empathy for other people, or we don't. And I think that when I, kind of started, like, left my recovery community, started drinking and using again, and went on this like quest for, success and legitimacy, I just lost a lot of that. And that's not to say that I didn't love people or wasn't trying my best to do what I thought was right and to do good. And it's so interesting today because as a criminal defense, I should finish the story, right? So the U.S. attorney, top of my game, hating myself inside. On the outside, everything's great. On the inside, it's awful. And I was very lonely, and I had an affair with a lawyer in my office who was married to a lawyer who also worked in my office. And it was like, it was like the pinnacle of worst decision making ever. I mean, it's almost like when I hear myself say it out loud, it's almost like if you wrote it for a soap opera, they'd say, no, this is a little over the top. Nobody will
Yeah.
buy this. No one's that stupid or reckless. But I was really at that point where I just didn't have the strength or the agency to do anything else. Like, I just had sort of given up on myself, and I was so miserable. It's like and the drugs and alcohol weren't working anymore, right? They weren't helping me sleep. They weren't making me forget. They weren't making me happy. They weren't fun. It doesn't mean I wasn't still doing them, but they weren't working. And I needed something else. I needed a new drug. And that relationship was a new drug. It was something to distract me that for a very brief time made me feel amazing, made me feel like I hadn't felt in years. And that isn't because I didn't have a good marriage or my husband wasn't a good man. It was none of that. It wasn't because it wasn't that kind of relationship. It was a drug. It was an addiction. It was an adrenaline rush. And it was also part of my effort to lean into this persona of this badass, prosecutor, because that's who he was, because he was the drug chief at my office, because he and I would go sit in the wire room and listen to gang members on wires, because we would hang out with agents and undercover people after work and drink and late into the night, and that persona, that made me feel somehow both, stimulated, but it also made me feel safe. It somehow was okay. And I had this real sense of, if you had to do what I do, you would do this too.
Mm-hmm.
Like me and this guy, and these agents, like we're keeping America safe,
And this is
and
the price we pay,
right,
to do it.
right. So if we need to go out and tie one on and,
Yeah.
make out behind the bar, that's what needs to happen.
Right.
And it was sick and wrong, and it hurt a lot of people. And, I've suffered a lot of consequences from those choices, and not just me, but a lot of people have suffered consequences from those choices.
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, just like the drugs and alcohol, the feeling good part of that didn't last very long. And then it was just awful.
Yeah.
And the come down was hard. And then the relationship evolved into something twisted and destructive and, painful. And I was still in that office, and he was still on my management team, and I had to see him every day. And so my husband found out, I came clean. We started going to marriage therapy, and I started going to individual therapy. But as long as I was in that job, I couldn't get better. I was taking psychotropic drugs. I was, going to acupuncture. I was seeing a psychiatrist, a psychologist, a marriage couples counselor, going to acupuncture, taking psychotropic medicine. It didn't matter. I couldn't escape myself, and I was still working, 60 hours a week and in that environment. And eventually the man that I had had an affair with, even though it had been over for some time and he had moved on to extramarital affair number, I don't know what number it was, but whatever one that was after me.
Some other number. Yeah.
Yeah, some other number. He reported me for sexual harassment, because based on the fact that I was a supervisor.
Mm-hmm.
And I got a call from Maine Justice confronting me, saying, this allegation has been made, and I admitted it. Unfortunately, when in my admission, I also minimized the extent of the sexual relationship. And that was really not because I thought I was going to minimize the consequences to myself, or I was going to impact, the department's ability to investigate and make sure they did what was right. In fact, I left the office that day voluntarily and said I was resigning and never came back.
Mm.
However, the reason that I minimized the sexual relationship is because I suddenly felt like that 15-year-old girl again.
Mm.
I felt like that dirty little girl. And I felt like the person on the other end of the phone, who was a man who was in his 70s, who was very intimidating, who I already had a very, let's just say, unpleasant working relationship with. I felt slut shamed. I felt incredibly shamed, and I didn't want to tell him about the sex I had with this guy,
Right.
And that ended up being the basis of a 3-month suspension by the Oregon State Bar. So I was not suspended for having a relationship with a coworker. I was suspended because I wasn't honest. I was dishonest in my minimization of the relationship the first time I was confronted in my office with a phone call.
And after all of this occurs, at some point, you recognize that there's more going on. I mean, there's so much going on with you that needs help, and you actually get help.
Well, and this is where I will say thank God for my family, and thank God for my privilege, because I really, frankly, so I left the office in March of 2015, but I can look back and having done the work that we do, sort of in recovery, but also the work that I did for my lawyer when she was representing me during countless investigations on the heels of all of this, and you've got to write chronologies and you've got to be very specific. So I have spent a lot of time kind of Monday morning quarterbacking this whole tragedy. And I can tell you that it was July of 2014 that I decided I didn't want to live anymore, and I stopped. I mean, that doesn't mean that I stopped breathing, but it means that I had relinquished any sense of agency or hope, I guess. Like I was just waiting to die, and I would drive recklessly. I stopped taking my blood pressure medicine. I didn't want my children to have the pain of having their mom die by suicide, but I would pray for some kind of natural causes to take place. And I just had this impending sense of doom, like that it was inevitable. And I didn't know how or why, but I was convinced that, I was on my way. And I also believed that I was irredeemable, that there was no possibility that I was ever going to redeem my career, my marriage, my family, that everything, that prior to death, that everything would be lost. And I was just sort of waiting for it to happen. And that was how I was living my life from July of 2014 until it finally did happen, until it finally came to fruition in March of 2015, which was somewhat of a relief. But when I got home the next day, I, was bombarded with the press and, people coming to my house and harassing my neighbors. And it was just awful. And then the investigation, the Office of Inspector General, and just calls at all hours of the night. And they were calling my friends and everybody was, it was just this nonstop. And of course, my husband was devastated, and I wasn't the most popular person in my house. And I didn't have I felt like I didn't really have a refuge. And in the midst of all of that, and my suicidal ideation and actions, it led my husband and my sister and my therapist to get together and strategize about finding an inpatient placement for me. I remember my husband saying to me, well, we found a couple places that look really good that your sister Khaki and your therapist both seem to like, and that our insurance will cover. One is in Palm Springs and the other is in Lindstrom, Minnesota. And I was like, definitely Palm Springs. He's like, you're going to Minnesota. Yeah. So that's where I ended up. I ended up at Hazelden Betty Ford in Lindstrom, Minnesota. And they have a program for legal professionals because lawyers are special and we need our own special program.
Lawyers are special. And you don't mean that you mean that more in the pejorative way, I think.
Sarcastically, yeah. We think we're special. And so, and it is true in a way though, Melissa. I mean, I do think that whether it's justified or not, and I think it's part of this miracle that we call peer support, which is what every successful recovery program is based on, is one addict helping another. And that's true of, dozens of different recovery programs that I'm aware of. And it's with the magic sauce, that a guy named Bill and a guy named Bob figured out in like 1934. And it's now the gold standard for every type of mental health treatment is peer support. And lawyers, I think that's also important because we do feel like we're different. And part of the difference is many of the people that were in that program still had their house, still had their car, still had money in the bank, and maybe were even still working and working successfully, but that didn't mean they weren't addicts. So when they're in, it's good for us to have each other because it's that same. It's that, oh, I relate to that, and some of the lawyers in the program had lost everything, gotten 10 DUIs and gone to prison, so it's all over the map, but nobody's bottom is the right bottom. I mean, we all have our own sense of incomprehensible demoralization that motivates us to do something different. And
Mm.
whatever that is for any individual is whatever that is.
My
Um,
sponsor, Peggy and Marin, she said, Melissa, you can get off the elevator whenever you want, but it's going
right.
one direction down. And
Hmm.
I mean, that is the truth.
Yeah,
But,
that's absolutely right. And the thing that's funny too is so I went to rehab, I was there for 6 weeks. I came home and I started all over again. So for a year, I mean, I just tried to strip everything off, right? Like I quit all the boards I was on. I didn't work. I and the other and I tried to just be with my family and just start there with my children, with my husband, trying to just repair
Mhm.
those relationships and the damage that I had done. I also, when I was in rehab, I began a practice of meditation for the first time in my life. I'd been introduced to yoga and meditation before, but it had never been a consistent practice for me. So I began meditation practice. I I remember, and the other thing that was happening is the consequences of my actions were taking place pretty consistently for my first 3 years of sobriety. So you go to meetings and you hear people talk about like, oh, I've got 90 days and my wife's coming back and I've got 6 months and I got a job and I've got a year, I just bought a new car, like, and everyone's
And yours
doing
was
like
kind of
what
the opposite, right? You're like,
it
I
was
have
the
six
opposite.
months and
Everything was like all the consequences happened after rehab. Nothing happened before, right? Like everything was just I mean I totaled my car. So, and I didn't have any money because I wasn't working. I had to cash out my retirement. I mean, I spent $90,000 on legal fees. So I've always worked for the government and I didn't come from rich parents and I still had student loans. So I didn't, it really destroyed me financially. And so suddenly, like I literally had no car. I had no money in the bank. My credit cards are maxed out. And and the way that things were with my husband was like, oh yeah, you can use my car if you want to use it to haul the kids around or go to the grocery store, but like it's my car,
yeah, yeah.
And so I was walking to meetings and standing outside and bumming cigarettes off people because I didn't have money to buy a pack. I will tell everyone I haven't had a cigarette in 7 years, more than that. It will be
Congratulations.
8 years in November. So, but when I first got back, I had started smoking and I was still smoking. So yeah, and then I was, I'd lost my reputation. I was still being featured on a regular basis in the Oregonian as the investigations were ongoing. It took 3 years for the Oregon State Bar to even start proceedings against me. It was like, by that time I'd gone back to work and I had clients. So that was a little inconvenient. But my ultimately, after really trying to repair things, my husband and I decided that it was time to let it go. And so we separated. I moved into my own house. I bought a house and he helped me to do that. And I started my own law practice 6 years ago. And today I have an office in the Pearl and I have 3 lawyers working there with me, two of which are also in recovery and out and proud about it. And we have the kind of practice where you don't have to make up a story if you need a mental health day, and
Yeah,
if you say, I need to get out of here and go to a meeting, we say go.
right.
We do share some personal stuff sometimes with our clients if we think it will serve our clients. And we find that many of our clients are served by our honesty and vulnerability and the strength of our recovery stories because we're human beings like them and we've also experienced hardship.
Well, I think
So,
that it's so important that you do that. And, so much of the law, and we were talking a little bit about this before we hopped on the interview about so much of what happens in the law is this walling off, and somehow it's unprofessional to share a personal story or to be vulnerable sometimes with a client or something like that. And certainly it's not always appropriate. You definitely have to be discerning when that happens. And it can happen at really inconvenient times. And I was telling another guest about this, where I was a prosecutor and I was at a settlement conference, kind of a like a just it wasn't anything major. Like it was not a ballot measure 11. It was not anything, but this woman, and she was about as different as she could be from me. But somehow in this settlement conference, I saw her, this person that I was supposed to be prosecuting. Well, I was prosecuting. And I saw her for her entire self and not
Ah,
just the piece.
mm,
And
mm,
I sat there and for those who aren't lawyers, we're sitting in a settlement conference, we're in the courtroom. It's certainly a professional setting, but it's not on the record. The judge is,
mhm.
sitting down in front of me, and I'm next to the defense lawyer and her client. And I got choked up. And I suddenly didn't know what to do with myself because it seemed
Ah,
inappropriate, but then I just let it be. Right. And I apologized. I said, I'm sorry, I'm a little emotional here. And everyone was like, that's okay. And then we talked about it. And we ended up with, I think, was the really right result. Right. You talked about justice, about this, we have to look at the person who has committed the crime, and we have to put them in a better position than when they came in. And I think we got to that result because of that, right? Not that it was
right.
all
Because
me or anything. I mean, the defense attorney was doing a great job. The client was doing a great job. The judge was 100% present. And so was
you
I.
guys were all connecting. You were
Yes.
all open to
Yeah.
having an authentic experience, of connection.
Yes.
And that is something that's very rare in my experience
Mine
in
as
the
well.
justice system, that people allow themselves. And I would just say and commend you for that, because one of the things I really struggle with is that I now see these prosecutors. And oftentimes, because it's me and I think about myself, I will see young female prosecutors that are just, on fire, and they're so righteous and
Mm,
indignant and, certain that they're doing the right thing. And some of them have said to me, like, it's the outcome isn't on me, I just do my job. And I think it is on you. Like, if you're bringing this case, it is absolutely on you. Be responsible for it. Like, this isn't
mm,
throw spaghetti at the wall and see if it sticks. You
mhm,
know, it's is this the right thing to do? And that's how I was trained as a prosecutor, by old school, old white men in Coos County. That's how they
mhm,
trained me. They said, you don't ever do it if you don't think it's right. You have so much power,
mhm,
and you need to use it wisely and with great discretion,
mhm.
because you will be destroying people's lives.
That's
And
how I was trained too. And I do find
yeah,
it somewhat, it's a little bit funny that it was the older, wiser men. And
old white
you know,
dudes, yeah,
old
that
white
ran the
dudes
office. Yeah,
turned out they knew what they were talking about when it came to that. Not all of them, of course,
yeah,
but
right.
the good ones did, and they took it really seriously. And that was and I think, I have noticed there still are some of those, and they're not all old white men. Some of them are
Right,
young
right,
women, some of them are persons of
right.
color, you know,
Sure.
but it still is kind of rare, you know, or and
Yeah,
it should be the norm. It,
yeah. And it's just, and the thing that's so difficult for me is sometimes I will see these prosecutors doing what they're doing, and my clients, and I also will hear from other defense attorneys that I know, they'll be so, then they will become righteous, right? And say, well, that person, that prosecutor is a bad person. They don't care. They're evil. They have big egos. They're judgmental. They're whatever, right? And I say, they're me, I was exactly like that. Like they're where they are in their development, like they're motivated by believing that they are doing the right thing, that they are wearing the white hat, that they
Right.
are protecting vulnerable people from bad people.
Mhm.
And they're doing the best that they can, and if they could do better, they would be doing better. But when I think about everything that I had to go through to shatter the layers and layers and layers of indoctrination and lies that I had surrounded myself with and breathed in, and just had been shellacked on me layer after layer, it I don't think I could have ever broken out of it unless I had completely blown up my life. Like I needed to have my bullshit exploded,
Yeah.
in order to be humble enough to be honest with myself and to really see things as they are, not see things as I am or as I want to see them, or what I'm telling myself so that I can feel better about whatever it is that I'm doing. And, so I think that's the opportunity that any great, loss or trauma or disappointment can give to us. But it's up to us to seize that opportunity. It's a chance to, they say, what is that slogan? Like, today is the first day in the rest of your life, right? Like
Right.
every day is an opportunity to do it different, to start doing it different. And you string together enough of those 24 hours and it just becomes the way it is. You
Mhm.
don't even have to think about it anymore.
And what I find so amazing, I mean, you went, and I think a lot of people in recovery have had to go through that stripping away, to get at the core. And I always think about it this way, and I hope you do too. They talk about in certain recovery communities about restoring ourselves to
Right.
sanity. And I love that. And it took me a long time in recovery till I understood that it said restore. And what that really meant was that it had always been good. I just needed to
Right.
go back to that place. Because, like you, I had felt like, oh, I was the bad girl, or, not worthy, or there was something wrong or bad about me. And it was like what I was learning was no, 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 no. All of that goodness we are born with. And it doesn't actually go away. It just gets, like you said, shellacked
Yeah.
with all of this ugliness, right? But I also think there's an opportunity lest other people, think that you have to like go through the ringer in order to come out the other
Right.
side.
Right.
That there's a real opportunity in our profession and other professions to call this out from the beginning, and maybe, I don't know, train lawyers in law
Mm.
school, right? About what it is to be a human, what it is to integrate, what it is to be vulnerable, how to care for ourselves so that we can care for others and provide the best, representation. I mean, I just think there's this opportunity for that.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I want to even challenge that premise and say, I wish we were teaching that everywhere that we teach anything,
Yes,
starting in
yes.
preschool, starting in at the youngest of ages, to be teaching everybody how to connect with
Mhm.
themselves and how to connect with. I remember in rehab, the day that I was leaving sort of the residential section after 28 days, transitioning into like the second phase for the last 2 weeks, my counselor, who was also an old white dude that reminded me of a Jimmy Buffett song, I freaking loved him. He said, I want you to, he goes, for the next few months, what I really want you to do, whether it's in your meditation, in your journaling, whatever, is answer the question, what does Amie want? And I remember
Mm.
that made me so angry. I mean, I rolled my eyes. I may have told him to fuck off. Like, I just was like, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. I mean, first of all, who cares? Because I was very much in the self-flagellation phase of recovery
Right,
where I
right,
was
right.
like, I don't deserve to want anything. I don't deserve anything. I should, whatever, bad things should happen to me and karma should happen. And so I just thought that's crazy because, there is an element of some of the recovery programs that we have been to that is very much beating yourself up and shaming yourself, And like when I work with women, I never use the phrase character defects. I always, I'm like, hey, there were things that served you that there were survival skills. So it's, I was really not down for that. And today I get it. Like today I get it. Like I was never taught as a kid to think about what I wanted. That was
Right.
selfish or that was irrelevant or, it was always, how can I serve others and what can I do? And I'm not saying that's not important because I actually believe that service is the highest form of spiritual expression. But we can't really be of service in a way that is clean if we don't come from a place of wholeness. Otherwise we're just being a martyr or a codependent. We're in service so that we get something, and we need to first have, our oxygen mask on before we can help the child next to us or the person who needs assistance. And that is just something I had not ever really understood. And so I think, Melissa, that if we could teach that at every level, but like with some intensity in law school, which is where, because people who go to law school end up being very powerful and they end up having huge impact on the lives of other people. And right now, my experience anyway, is that those people that have that impact are the least emotionally, spiritually healthy people that I know. They're the most egocentric, self-absorbed, competitive, judgmental, people, work driven, that don't have a practice of self-care because they see it as a weakness or something they don't have time for.
The culture of law really proliferates that, right? It
Right.
I mean,
Rewards that.
it absolutely rewards that that drive at the expense of everything else. And that perfectionism, the inability to ever have any faults, to always be right because you never know when somebody's going to point out that you're wrong. I mean, it really,
Never
really,
ask a question you don't know the answer to because you need to be 100% in control, which
right.
just illustrates the point that a trial is not about a fact finding. It's about presenting the narrative that you have constructed and not being bothered by anyone else's answer that might not jive with the narrative that you have constructed because you need to be totally in control of it.
Right. It's interesting. I interviewed somebody else for this podcast. It hasn't published yet, but I'll be interested to see what you have to say. She's a doctor, and she would say the same thing about medicine and how
Absolutely. And Mike, I represent a lot of doctors and they are the most challenging clients that I have. I mean, I would rather have a 15-year-old drug addict that, I don't know, stabbed somebody than a 50-year-old surgeon. They are very much like, and I will say, like, there's different characteristics of different people within these professions, right? So a lot of the things that we've been talking about are characteristics of litigators, and that's the field in which you and I are most familiar. But in my experience, having worked with different kinds of lawyers, especially now because I have a more varied practice, it's not necessarily true of people that do general counsel work or appellate work, right? So it's really true of litigators because we are like the gladiators of the legal system. We eat raw meat for breakfast and we go into the arena and we fight till the death. And it takes a strong ego to do that. And some of the things that might be character defects in other realms are huge assets in that realm. And doctors are the same way. And I would say surgeons are the litigators of the medical world.
Yeah.
I actually went through a phase where I was like, I'm not representing any more surgeons. And now I'm like, I won't have more than one at a time. Like, so, I'll take a podiatrist any day.
Well, and I do think that's true. I mean, the doctor that I interviewed, she's lovely, Delia Caramonte, and she is an integrative palliative medicine doctor. So she's kind of
That's so
fused
great.
the two
Yeah.
practices and is on a mission to teach other physicians how to do that. So
hmm
that not only, and she believes, like you and I were just talking about, that it comes first with caring for oneself and then being able to care for the whole person. And I think that's so important. And certainly, so there are, my point is, there are different, as you said, different types of doctors, different types of lawyers, different types of salespeople, different types of whatever, but it's still something that is lacking in our culture, right? We are we are Americans. It's the American dream. Just pull yourself up by the bootstraps, and it's all, what you do and what you cause to have happen. It's not to do with your community or your circumstances or your privilege or your whatever, which is a bunch of bullshit, because you and
hmm
I know it's all about
Oh, absolutely.
that, right?
Yeah.
So, so now it becomes, what do we do? What else can we do y- so that we can create the kind of culture that celebrates the whole person and is at the very least compassionate and empathetic, and while still holds people responsible who need to be held responsible, but does so compassionately and leaves them better than when they came. What else can we do?
Well, I do think that it's less about, I mean, as much as I am so proud that we passed ballot measure 110 and the things that are now starting to happen as a result of that in terms of access to treatment and harm reduction and, greater compassion for people who suffer from addiction. I don't think that we're going to solve this with policy changes. I don't think we're going to solve it with legislation. I don't think we're going to litigate our way through it to make any kind of difference. I do think it is in trying to in a collective intentional effort at healing the people who work in the halls of power.
Mm,
When you look at as U.S. attorney, of course, I had a lot of contact with senators and Congress people and heads of agencies and political appointees, and both at the state and the federal level. And I, would just observe that, like, at the higher you get, the more ill people are
mm,
and the more dysfunctional. And it actually appears to me to be sort of almost like a job requirement. And now I mean, I've mentored some women who have had political aspirations, and I will always begin by trying to talk them out of it, because I say, if you are, striving for these things, the wholeness and integration and health and wellness, going into this is literally moving away from everything you're striving for,
mm,
because you need to have a very tough skin, and you need to be very self-centered and very egocentric and very able to, you know let go of whatever your ideals are in order to pivot towards whatever the messaging is that is going to get the result that you want, which is to be elected. If you're not 100% committed to that being the only goal, then you won't win.
mm,
I mean, that's the way to win an election. And
mhm,
so you already have people that are geared towards being willing to do that before they even get to the starting gate, or else they're wasting so much time and money, right? That and they're going to lose, or they're not going to make it very far. Maybe they could be a county commissioner, but they're not going to be, a state senator.
yeah.
So I think, to begin with, it's actually a combined effort with both kind of what we were just talking about, which is like, you got to teach this stuff in law school, you got to teach this stuff in high school, got to teach this stuff in preschool. So start, in the educational institutions, trying to get the people coming up to have some of these skills. But I also think you've got to change the people that are there, or at least start to target the people who are in power, because the people who are in power are the gatekeepers to the new people coming into power. And as long as those systems are so toxic, it's just going to corrupt all the people coming in. I wasn't the person coming into the criminal justice system that I was coming out. I was full of ideals and ethics and, good feelings about people and being critical of police and all of that. But by the time I left, I was just another cog in the machine.
Right.
And so we need somebody with power in the machine to, loosen up those old cogs and, replace them with something more modern and progressive and open, and something that is fueled by love and not fear.
Yeah. So, no, I love that. And so, as we're sort of winding this up, you were asked a question in a different podcast of what you would have told your 18-year-old self. I'm not going to ask you that. I'm going to ask you, what do you tell your children?
I love you. You're perfect,
Mm, yeah.
but you don't need to find enlightenment because you're already enlightened.
Mm.
There's nowhere to look for it but inside yourself. I mean, it's funny. My youngest is 15, Henry, and he's asked me, like, when I'll say those things, he'll say, well, what if I killed somebody? What if I committed a heinous crime?
You got to love the 15-year-olds. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I'll say he's a Taurus and he's so much like his dad. I mean, he's just a little curmudgeon. And so he's, and I say, I would still love you. What if I murdered a child? I'm like, yeah, I would be disappointed. I would be angry. I would think that you would need to be separated from society so you didn't hurt anyone again. But I would come visit you in prison and I would tell you that I love you. I would never stop loving you, because my love isn't conditioned on anything other than, in my speak, it's like, the God self, your Buddha nature, your white light, which, as you said, like every baby is born pure and then things happen. And so, that's what I tell them. I know this about parenting, and you also are a mom of a teenager. And I know this from being a teenager, that you cannot tell your kids anything. So I try to stay away from like the more advice, like what they should major in college, or who they should date, or, whatever, where they should work, or whether or not my middle son should put all of his money into Dogecoin. Like, they're going to do those things.
Right.
And they're going to, learn from the natural consequences of their own mistakes. And that's what being a kid is about. So I try to give them a lot of space, because I know I had a lot of space. I had all the space in the world. I had what I thought was too much space, but also the truth is it served me. I learned a lot of things from trial and error, and I gained a lot of insight and instincts about people at a pretty young age. And I do think that a lot of parents today are overprotective, and that kids get into college and they go crazy because they've never had any freedom. And so I would rather have my kids making those mistakes while I'm still right here.
Right. And you can love and support them through those mistakes.
Right.
Yeah.
So I try not to do too much preaching, but more just making sure that they really know that my role in this world is to be their soft place to land.
And they know you. I mean, you are open.
And I don't keep secrets. I'm an open book. So like, if they want to look at my phone or be like, ew, what did your boyfriend text you? I'm like, you want to see? I don't care. And then they're like, no, we don't. But I spent a lot of my time as in this world as a closed book, keeping secrets and telling lies to myself. And that meant to everybody else too. And I know that my kids did not feel like they could trust me. and didn't know what to expect from me. And today they absolutely do. Like, I mean, I think my life is pretty cool. It's like when I'm home, it's pretty boring. I go to bed early, Henry and I eat dinner at the table, and then we watch a little TV. And right now we're watching something called Flatbush Misdemeanors.
Okay. Is it
It's a
good?
pretty cute, it's on Netflix, I think, or no, it's on Prime. It's like a 30-minute sort of comedy. It's pretty cute. But anyway, so yeah, I meditate, and then I talk to my boyfriend on the phone before I go to sleep, and I crash. And, I try to keep in my lane. I used to think it was my job to make the whole world better and to save all the people.
Yeah.
And now I just think my job is like my kids, my garden, my clients, my dogs,
That's a beautiful life. I remember, I don't know if you ever remember this bar. It was called Ted's, and it was in
Yeah.
San Anselmo.
Sausalito?
San
San
Anselmo.
Anselmo.
Spent a
Yeah.
lot of time at Ted's, and a
Yeah.
lot of really interesting people there. I met Greg Allman there once.
I met all the rock stars at some place
Oh yeah,
in the
no,
Bay Area in
100%.
the 80s. Yeah.
That's just the way it was. And
I just went to see Night Ranger, and this guy in McMinnville who I know, who's, really good friends with who's a really straight-laced, this is my judgment, accountant, is like, that's the box I put him in.
yeah, yeah.
And he was just rocking out to Night Ranger.
Love it. Love it.
And he's like, "Oh my God, are you a Night Ranger fan?" I'm like, "I used to do blow with these guys in the 80s." And he's like, "Oh, that's funny." And I was like, "No, really?"
No, for real. Yeah. People never believe. They don't believe. What I was going to say is I remember being at Ted's one night, and it was not a good night for me. And my husband looked at me, and I've been married now for 27 years. And he's crazy enough to stay with me through all of it. And although I've been pretty stable for the last 22 years and counting.
Yeah.
But he said to me, Melissa, you cannot save the world you cannot save the world if you can't save yourself. And I'll never forget that, because that's exactly what you're saying, is like, we need to focus on ourselves, put our own oxygen mask on first, and then those closest to us that we love. And then we have to trust.
And the real work is the inner work. And I remember my mother used to tell me this all the time, and I just didn't believe her. But what I was really doing was avoiding doing the inner work, because I was a coward. I was too scared. It was too overwhelming, and I was afraid.
Yeah.
And so I was distracting myself with all of this external stuff, all this big stuff, so that I didn't have to ever be real with myself. And you can't avoid it. It doesn't go away. I mean, it's always there. It's like you can't escape yourself, and the only way out is through. And so I think that the best thing that we can do to save the world is to sit down, and when we breathe in, know that we're breathing in, and when we breathe out, know that we're breathing out. I mean, that's where we need to start.
Yes.
And that is the best thing we can do for the rest of the world.
I love that, Amie. You have just been such a pleasure to talk with. And as people could probably tell, you and I could probably talk forever. So we'll have you on again, and we'll talk.
And we'll have to just hang out. We just have to have lunch again. Although every time we have lunch, it turns into a 3-hour lunch.
It does.
We need to go away for like a weekend, like a yoga retreat or something.
Oh, that sounds wonderful. Well, on that note, I'm going to take us off the recording, and I'm going to thank everybody for listening. And thank you so much for spending the time. So wonderful to have you. Hey everybody, if you like this conversation and are looking to align your work and life with your purpose, or uncover your purpose in the first place, work with me. I coach people ready to uncover and appreciate their worth, make an impact, and find meaning and purpose in the work they do, whether that's personal or professional work. Get your mind right and make your plan for impact, and coach with me. Connect with me for 15 or 20 at the Calendly link in the show notes below, and talk about coaching with me. Hey everybody, it's Melissa, and I'm wondering if you all can relate. Have you ever caught yourself procrastinating or maybe doubting your abilities, or maybe you have a black belt inner critic like I do or have had that wants to sabotage your every move with judgment and perfectionism expectations? It might keep you stuck, it might keep you anxious and away from your full potential. The Positive Intelligence Program, PQ, is a powerful 6-week journey designed to help you quiet those saboteurs, embrace positivity, and find flow in your life. Through daily practices and weekly focuses, we'll work together to build your mental fitness. The PQ app will guide you every step of the way and support you, and you'll be supported either by myself in a one-on-one or in a small group of like-minded individuals where you can share insights and progress. So reach out, contact me at info@thefullymindful.com to find out how we can work together one-on-one or in a small group today.